David Pratt as much as I do. I was wearing that guy out, working him to death, preaching. Really enjoyed having him with us this summer, and I know you did as well. But it's good to be back, and it's good to get back to the routine again. And it's certainly a rich blessing to see you and to see your faith and devotion to the Lord that brings you out. Very grateful for you. If you would, please open to Joshua chapter 5. Joshua chapter 5, I want to consider a thought with you that's found throughout this whole chapter. So if you would, just mark this text and we'll come back to it this morning. But Joshua, of course, is the account of the man who would replace Moses in leading the people into the land of Canaan. We understand that Moses was the one who delivered the people from Egyptian bondage, from slavery, gave them the law, established his covenant with them and God. And that's all found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, everything about that. But what we see in Joshua is that Moses, as the book starts out, Moses has died. The servant of God has died, the servant of the Lord. And so the Lord is speaking to Joshua. And he lets him know that Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. And that's how the book starts out. And so God is preparing Joshua to lead the people into this land that they were supposed to take 40 years earlier, but their parents and grandparents did not have the faith to obey God when he said to go in. And so they were forced as a nation to walk or wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And so that older generation has died out and this younger generation has matured. And now they're about to take the land and conquer it under the leadership of Joshua. But God had to prepare Joshua to lead the people. And then Joshua had to prepare the people to actually accomplish this invasion. And there are principles that he taught them in preparing them to do this great work for the Lord, to accomplish this great challenge. Now, I think there are principles that we can use today in preparing people today in living for God. Specifically, I thought about how we can prepare the next generation to serve the Lord. Not just our children and grandchildren, certainly that's important, but it's anybody who is converted to the Lord or anybody who is interested in serving the Lord, that the people need to be prepared to serve God and live for him in this world, especially when we are gone. But that's what he's doing. He is preparing these people. And like I said, there are principles he taught them in being ready to take this land that I believe are principles we can use today in walking with faith in God and having a stronger relationship with him. For instance, in Joshua chapter 5, I believe the text starts out by showing that the people were to remember the greatness of God. Because you see this in verse 1, where it is stated how the people of Canaan had heard about the victories the Israelites were having on this side of the Jordan before crossing over into Canaan itself, and the people were intimidated. The people were intimidated to hear that the Israelites were on their border and were about to come over. It says in verse 1, so it was when all the kings of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until we had crossed over, that their heart melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. And that's a beautiful thought, a great thought to introduce this text. That these people had heard about what God had done for the Israelites. Not just in leaving Egypt and the Red Sea, which is fascinating, but now the next generation passed through a river on dry ground. through the Jordan, and how God opened up the Jordan and allowed the people to walk in. And other people had heard about that. They had heard about the success of Israel in whipping people on the east side of the Jordan, the great kings that were there. And now they're coming in to the land, and the people who resided in Canaan were terrified. Never even saw the Israelites, but they were terrified because they heard they were coming in. That's exactly what God said would happen if they had followed him and obeyed his word, that God would provide a reputation for the Israelites that would intimidate people because they knew that God was working with them. In Deuteronomy chapter 11, it says in verse 25, God promised them that no man shall be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will put the dread of you and the fear of you upon all the land where you tread, just as he has said to you. Well, we see that's happening. So the people are scared. They're scared of the Israelites because they know they have a powerful God leading them. They have a powerful God who is making it possible for them to succeed. God has always been a God of power. And he, in his judgment and good wisdom, has used that power to bless his people on occasion. And this is certainly one of those occasions. But it's just like he promised. He promised them that if you just keep my covenant, if you trust me and follow me, you will succeed. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, a fascinating text on the promises God made these people if they kept this covenant. And in Deuteronomy chapter 28, notice where it says in verses 8 through 10 that their reputation would be sound. It says in verse 8, the Lord will command the blessings on you in your storehouses and in all to which you set your hand, and he will bless you in the land which the Lord your God has given you. The Lord will establish you as a holy people to himself, just as he has sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways. Then all the peoples of the earth shall see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of you. Well, Joshua 5 is showing that's exactly what was happening. People were scared. They were scared because they knew Israel had a very powerful God. But see, what good was that for the Canaanites and all the residents of that land to believe that about God if God's own people didn't believe that? They needed to realize and appreciate that they were serving a very powerful God who was on their side. And they needed to believe that everything he was doing for them was for their own good. Saw the account of a woman who was talking to her grandchildren. And she let them know, she said, when I first became a Christian years ago when I was younger, she said, I did not want to surrender fully to God in all things because I felt like I would have been missing out on something if I did. But she said, I've learned in time that following God brings real happiness. Everything he wants us to do is the best for us. That's wisdom. That's a woman who's been in this world and she's seen some things, and she's, I think, described what a lot of us sometimes feel. We don't give 100% because we might miss out on something. We might miss out on something if we go completely in with God. But we have to understand everything God wants us to do is to bless us, to enhance us, to make us better. And he is a God who will bring success to his people. That's what Joshua had to know. That as he met this great challenge of leading these people into foreign soil, conquering the land, Joshua needed to know that all that God did for Moses with his mighty, powerful hand, he was willing to do and was going to do for Joshua. But Joshua had to believe. He had to remove fear. In Joshua chapter 1, going back to the introduction, in verse 5 beginning, it says, no man, this is God talking to Joshua. Verse 5, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage. For to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. I'm sure that if the younger people in here, or people who are new to serving the Lord, and if you would ask an older person that if their life is better for serving God, if they're being honest, I'm sure they would all agree it is significantly better. The sooner you live for God, the better your life's going to be. The happier you're going to be. Now, what's wonderful about God is even if we haven't served Him at a young age, whenever we do come to Him, whatever life we have left in service to Him will still be significantly better than it would have been without Him. But it's even better to serve God at a younger age. And I am confident that every person would say that in here who is serving the Lord, that it's to your advantage. It's to your advantage to walk by faith and have courage in God and conviction in Him, and to see His greatness and to trust in that greatness, and to take to heart the things that God was saying to Joshua. You have courage, follow me, and you will succeed. It's a great, great message they needed to hear. Well, you keep going in this text of Joshua chapter 5. One thing we also see that's a good principle for us is that you have to get circumcised if you're going to serve the Lord. Going back to Joshua chapter 5, notice this with me in verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives for yourself, and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. So Joshua made flint knives for himself, and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised. But all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that He would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers that He would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Then Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised on the way. So you see in this text that one thing they had to do in following God and in taking this land is they had to have this physical surgery. The men had to be circumcised. And young people, if you don't know what that means, I'll let you ask your parents on the way home. That should be an interesting conversation. But this is something that God had used in time to identify His people. It goes back to Abraham, the people who descended from Abraham, but who became the Israelites. But it was a covenant God made with Abraham to identify those who would be of his family and associated with God. And what we see in Deuteronomy chapter 10 is that it was more than just a physical surgery. The purpose God had ultimately in requiring this of His people, that all the men would be circumcised, was to illustrate what it was to be like in their heart. That they were to be identified as the people of God who put away this world and who are serving the Lord completely. And that's what it meant. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, it says in verse 12 and 13, it says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command you today for your good." And then you notice in verse 16, it says, "Therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be stiff-necked no longer." So what was God's purpose? Well, it was to symbolize these are the people of God, and this was a mark of that. But ultimately, it was to show that they were to do this to their heart, that they were to cut away anything that interfered in their devotion to the Lord, their love for the Lord. God has always wanted them to love him. He's always wanted his people to love him and to trust him. And that's what this surgery represented. It said that you belong to God. I don't have it up there, but you can take the time to read in the law, especially in Exodus 21, when God allowed slavery at this time, he allowed slavery among the Israelites. And it was for various reasons. Sometimes you had to pay a debt to somebody, and then you would be their slave. And he allowed Hebrews, the Israelites, to have fellow Hebrews as slaves. Now, the condition was, it was to be limited to 6 years of service, and then to release them in the 7th year with the debt fully paid. That was the idea behind it. But in offering that slave his freedom, the law recognized that sometimes the slave didn't want to leave. That the slave wanted to be associated with that master because he loved the master and loved his family. And so he wanted to stay there with the master. Well, the law said that if that's the decision of the slave, then you were to take that slave and take his ear and punch a hole in it with an awl against the doorpost. You take that awl and you just hammer through the ear, leave that opening, and it would signify that here is a person who loves his master and wants to be associated and identified with his master. And when you saw that hole in somebody's ear, that's what it meant. Well, in a similar sense, that's what circumcision meant. That these were people who were known as the people of God, who love their master, who want to be associated with their master. And so they make this commitment in this physical surgery. The Bible teaches that you have to be circumcised to go to heaven. Physically, no, that law has passed. But in principle, God is still looking for people who want to be identified with him and are willing to cut away anything in this life that interferes with that relationship. Who are willing to be identified as his people and to accept the consequences of being associated with him, even if it means persecution and rejection. It doesn't matter, because my heart is circumcised and I belong to God. In Colossians chapter 2, it teaches in verses 11 through 13 how you and I still have to be circumcised to be associated with God. But he says it's in the heart. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 11, he says, "In him you were also circumcised, with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he is made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses." So it's a symbol. We are circumcised spiritually as a symbol that we belong to God. We no longer live for this world. We have removed that from our life, and we're committed to him. We're his property. And what the Bible teaches is that whenever we do that and we suffer persecution for it, just know that whatever pressure you face and whatever rejection you face, That's the equivalent of being circumcised. It's the equivalent of going through that pain to honor God. And a good example of that is in 1 Peter chapter 4, when the Bible teaches that there are going to be people who criticize you and reject you because you don't go along like you used to with the world. But you've cut that out of your life. You've removed that from your life, and now you're the child of God. And so he teaches that you endure that rejection because that's part of the circumcision. In 1 Peter chapter 4, it says in verse 3, "For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles." And that just simply represents a life of sin. When we walked in lewdness and lust and drunkenness, in revelries and drinking parties and abominable idolatries, in regard to these things, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. So he lets us know whatever persecution is there associated with living for God, that is part of being identified with our God. But we have that hole, right? We have that hole in our ear, or we have that circumcision because we want to be associated with God and we love him. And so we want it to be known we belong to him. Go back to Joshua 5. There's another good point here to consider. And that is the people had to start over. In Joshua chapter 5 and verse 9, it says, after he gave the instruction on circumcision, it says in verse 9, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day.'" God wanted them to know it's time to start over. It's time to move on from your past. That from this day forward, you're no longer going to be identified as the slaves that came out of Egypt, but rather you're going to be known as the people of God. And Gilgal represented that. Gilgal represented that new start. That now we're no longer who we used to be. Now we're a new people. Now we have a new purpose in life. They were no longer to see themselves as slaves, but rather they were to see themselves as the people of God. There comes a time when we have to do the same thing. When we have to forgive ourselves of past sins, past mistakes, and move on. To no longer define ourselves by those mistakes, because we're no longer slaves of sin. We're the people of God. And we are people who just simply have to trust in his mercy to forgive us and allow us to start over. And if God is willing to forgive us, we should be willing to forgive ourselves. How many times have we easily returned to sin because of defeating ourselves, because of how we see ourselves? That we're so ashamed of what we've done in the past, and we still, years later, let that define who we are today. And that's what God was showing these people. No more. Slavery's in the past. You're not a slave. You're a child of God. You are the people of God. You're the nation of God. Move forward as the people of God. And he says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to wipe out that name of Egyptian slavery from you. And I think that's a great principle for us. And he keeps on saying in the text that there are new blessings. There are new blessings for you to receive in going forward. Now here's what's interesting. In verse 11, they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on that very same day. And notice in verse 12, then the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land. And the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate food of the land of Canaan that year. Now that's interesting. I mean, for 40 years, pretty much, these people, every day they woke up, there was manna on the ground. that they had to prepare. Well, now they crossed the river Jordan. They're taking the land. They're eating from the land, and the manna's gone. The manna fulfilled its purpose. There were new blessings. There was new bread available to the people. And God was sharing that with them. And it's all symbolic. We need to let go of the past and partake of the new bread, the new life, the hope, the blessings that come from being known, not as a slave to our past sins, but as a child of God. But then there's a final point I want to make with you from this text in Joshua chapter 5, and I think it's a good lesson for all of us, that they needed to know they were not alone. It says in chapter 5, in verse 13 through verse 15, and it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us, or are you for our adversaries? And he said, No, but as the commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped, and said to him, Why does my Lord say to his servant, or what does my Lord say to his servant? Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. Well, what a fascinating experience. That here's this great being standing before Joshua. And he lets it be known, I command the Lord's army. Now he's talking about his army of angels. We serve a God who has created angels and has used angels throughout time to accomplish his will. In Exodus chapter 23, he said that he would bless his people by sending this angel that Joshua just met. In Exodus chapter 23, notice where God had already promised in verse 20 through verse 23, Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. But if you indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the land, as he describes there. So that's the God we serve. We serve a God who has angels of all different ranks, angels that can't be numbered. And as you see right here, you even have an angel that commands the whole army of God, of angels. Tremendous. Now, we can't see these creatures. It's not evident to us. That's demonstrated in the Bible. There was a time when the king of Syria was threatening the people of God. And the associate who was with the prophet of God, Elisha, saw this great threat from the king coming to invade the land. And Elisha told him to calm down because God was with them. In 2 Kings chapter 6, it says in verse 14, Then he sent horses, this is the king of Syria, sent horses and chariots and a great army there. And they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall we do? He answered, Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. The angels were already there. The army of the Lord was there, but this man could not see that. God has always used angels to carry out his work in this world. And the question, of course, is, does he still do this? Well, why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? He's always used angels. But here's what we can know, that we serve a God who will use all of his power to bless his people and to protect his people. And that's what that angel represented going into Canaan. God was not going to let Joshua do this by himself. God was going to lead Joshua, using these spiritual beings, these spiritual forces, to bring about success. The Bible teaches in Psalm 68 that we serve a God who uses his powers to bless his people. And we need to take comfort in that. In Psalm 68, it says in verse 17, the chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands of thousands. The Lord is among them, as in Sinai in the holy place. In verse 19, blessed be the Lord, who daily loads us with benefits, the God of our salvation. And I just have to trust that we serve a God who has not left us alone in this world, that he will work for his people and bless his people. And so I share these thoughts with us this morning, that these were good thoughts that Joshua shared with the people in preparing them to take this land to be their own. And it's a great lesson for us today, that we need to appreciate who we serve. We serve a very powerful God, a God of mercy. But he wants us to be fully dedicated to him from the heart. And he is a God who is willing to forgive us of everything and make it possible for us to start over. But we need to start over. We need to move on and know that he is a God who is not forsaken us. And so I ask you this question. What will become of those who have been shaped by our influence? Will they know that they can be the people of God and doing great things, or will they see themselves as defeated people, as slaves of sin? And I hope we can see a better message. If you here are not a child of God, we sing this song to persuade you to put your faith in God, like Craig did the other day, a very beautiful account of a man who just trusted God to save him in the way that God wants. And that's through Jesus. That if you want to be set free from sin, you have to have Jesus. He's how we start over. That blood saves us. And the only way you're going to come in contact with that blood is by obeying the gospel. You have to die to your sins, be buried with him in baptism, and raised to walk in newness of life. And that's all based on your conviction he is the Son of God who saves. So if you're ready to confess that and do that before God, we persuade you. If you need to make things right with God in any way, please come back to him as we stand and sing.